Welcome back. Today we are talking with Regina Phelps about the Summer of Crises 2023. Regina,
Hmm.
you mentioned something to me about permacrisis and
Oh,
polycrises.
don't you love all these new words? So
Mhm.
we've been talking about polycrisis, I think, for the last few months. And a polycrisis is really where you just got a simultaneous number of events that occur all kind of at the same time, and they can be coming slowly or rapidly. There was a new word which I failed to talk about when we started talking about polycrisis. That was the 2022 Collins Dictionary word of the year, and it was permacrisis. Now, permacrisis is a little bit different because what it is essentially is an extended period of time of crises and insecurity. So it's just like one thing kind of then extends into another, where the polycrisis is many different things. Boom, 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 boom. Ukraine war, economic instability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where the permacrisis is just one long, protracted thing. And you could kind of call the COVID-19 pandemic more in that permacrisis because it's one event, but extends over a long period of time. But what I've found kind of interesting is to think that these two words seem to be appearing, I don't know, everywhere now.
Mhm.
And based
Yeah.
on the things that have been going on just over the last weekend, but certainly over seemingly the last couple of years, it seems to be nonstop. And that makes me think of this weekend and Russia. So what do you think about Russia and what happened this weekend, Alex?
Wow. Well, when it first started, I woke up and turned on the TV and thought I'd check the state of the nation, so to speak. Not the show, just what's happening
Right.
here in
What's
Canada.
going on?
Did I miss anything overnight? And apparently I did. With the armed insurrection, Prigozhin,
Yep,
saying
we're
the name right,
doing.
and his march to Moscow. And by the end of the day, apparently it was over.
Right,
And
the abrupt stop of the
yeah,
March to Moscow.
abruptly stopped and was heading to, if it's all reports are correct, supposed to be heading to Belarus. Well, that got me thinking, oh my God, because 2 weeks ago,
Right,
Belarus received nuclear weapons.
right.
And now Prigozhin and his army of CNN estimated somewhere around 20 to 25,000 men,
Mercenaries.
mercenaries, yeah, heading that way, or that's where they will be heading. And I'm kind of going, hold on, heading to Belarus, nuclear weapons. That's moving away from the south and the east, where the current uh, front, bombing and fighting is, heading to the north because Belarus is north of Ukraine.
Right.
Well, Ukraine
Directly north of Kiev.
exactly is just north of the capital, and Prigozhin has said many times he wants to eliminate, for lack of a better way of saying it, eliminate the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, wait a minute. You just did an arms insurrection. You're moving your army to a place closer to the Ukraine capital, and you now have nuclear weapons at possibly his disposal. And I'm kind of like, oh my goodness, are we seeing the start of something even bigger
So
now?
you're thinking something different than most of the prognosticators are saying on television, which is essentially that this was some fulminating issue that Prigozhin had, and then really that Putin a sort of fight between the two of them, and then Putin sort of did whatever he did, and then Prigozhin just basically backed down. What you're saying is that maybe this is all planned,
It happened so fast
right?
that if it dragged on for a few days, then I could see it. Maybe I'd have an understanding, but it happened so fast.
Less than 24 hours, right?
Yeah, and we went from fighting the front lines to on your way to Moscow to on your way to Belarus. I'm going, wow, that where was the time for negotiations? Where was the time for talk? And I hope I'm wrong. It was the first thing that popped into my head, knowing that Belarus now has nuclear weapons, Soviet nuclear weapons at their disposal.
Right.
I thought, oh, and an armed army is now going to be
Right.
there.
Right.
I'm
Right.
like, oh my goodness. You know,
That would definitely be that would be the polycrisis of the century, wouldn't it?
yes.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I post a lot of things on LinkedIn, and over the last weekend, I posted a fair number of things about Russia. Fascinating, different perspectives. None of them about what you're forecasting or talking about, but it was interesting just to see the number of people that said and replies back to me that they really thought that this was sort of the slow burn of World War III. That really starting really with actually the beginning of the Ukraine war when it started 16 months ago, and that and also what's going on in China and the mercenaries down in Africa and so on. That this is really kind of a slow burn towards some World War III configuration.
Yeah, you know, World War One was what Archduke Ferdinand, his
Yep.
killing triggered it. World War Two, even though other things happened before, was the invasion of Poland. Well, what's happening now?
Right.
What's going to be that one final trigger? You
Right.
know, so
Yeah, it's a little it's unsettling, unnerving. You know, it's interesting because in the work that I do, many of my clients are large global corporations. And my spring and summer has been really absorbed with China and Taiwan in very much that same way. And so there's a lot going on in that space, in that part of the world, that has a huge impact on American companies. And because of the work I'm doing, I have a kind of a front row seat on watching this unfold. But one of the things that we've done is that we've been doing quite a few exercises to help companies figure out how to, you'll love the term, de-risk China, which I think is kind of funny. So the first time I was asked to design an exercise to de-risk China from their kind of portfolio of business, I thought to I said to my client, I said, where the hell did that word come from? I mean, like, I'd never heard of the word de-risk, right? So anyway,
what did they mean by it?
well, this is really bizarre. So the UN, not the UN, the EU, the president of the EU, for the last year had been talking about decoupling risk from China. So the idea that many companies and countries are kind of coupled with China, and that like kind of a marriage, if you will, in many ways, both economically and with manufacturing and so many things. And then at some point, the president of the EU, at a speech at the end of March, said, there's no way we can decouple. What we have to try and do is figure out how we can de-risk, which I don't think is possible at all, really. But that's and then literally the next day, I saw that in every business publication. And I didn't know about the speech at the time. And so I was thinking, like, did McKinsey come up with this overnight or something? I mean, like, what is this? Where did this word come from? And the whole concept is, and why I've been doing so many exercises on this topic in particular, is because not it's certainly the anxiety of the executives in a large corporation, but who's super anxious is the board, who has been driving this in their risk committee, saying, I want to know what you're doing, you, CEO and executives, to de-risk or minimize our exposure in China. Many of my clients are deep into China, as most of the world is. But I mean, there's been some really unnerving things about that country that really speak to the polycrisis, the permacrisis, and every other kind of crisis we can imagine that's been going on. And I ask everybody to really think about this. And people may say, listening to say, well, we don't have any work in China and we don't do anything in China. Well, yeah, but I bet you buy stuff from China. So, it's not just the fact that your company may be directly exposed, but let me just talk about that just for a minute. So in the last month, there's been 4 companies who have been rated, American companies, a couple of them big names like Bain and Company. And the ones that have been rated are consulting companies in particular, with a lot of intellectual property and also intellectual property of their customers, their clients. So what happens is that there's
And this is in China, right?
in China,
In China.
in China. And so there's a national security police in China who basically has carte blanche. You know, they can arrive with a search warrant, and if you're not there, the building owner will let them in. But usually they arrive when you're there, they show their permit, and then they just march right in. And then they just go into any office, any room, sit down. They'll ask for the password of the person whose computer they're sitting in front of. They'll go through, I don't know what. They'll take computer drives. They'll interview people. And in some cases, they actually took the executives away for further questioning. Now, most of these companies,
it sounds on this side like, oh my God, that's like a dystopian
right,
movie. You're just going in and kidnapping people.
right. It's like the Gestapo, if you will, or
Yeah.
something, right? And this is happening right now. So when this started happening in particular, this just sort of ratcheted up the blood pressure of most American companies, because even if they have sequestered computer systems in China, and they with no ability to connect to the United States or other countries, let's say, there are still ways that information can be taken and intellectual property can be stolen, essentially. And one of my clients said to me, isn't there like a kill switch that we could just push a button and it would vaporize everything on a network? And I said, I don't think so. But talk to your IP, IT person about that. And of course, we laughed over that because I talked to them and they said, like, what? But
that's a Hollywood thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
The kill switch. And so why this is important is that if anybody, you may not do work in China, but let's say that you are a manufacturer and you have some things made over there. They have your intellectual property to make that object or thing or whatever it is. And that could be at risk as well. So any work that you have done in China, any processes that you have done in China, all could be at risk. And I think companies are now beginning to deeply understand that. And coupled with that, I will say, is that most of my clients in their offices, they don't have anybody but primarily Chinese nationals working there, right? They're obviously highly skilled, very smart people working for this U.S. company. They're Chinese nationals. And the cost, the ratio, I've had people say different numbers to me, but like computer technology, that like the cost of 3 engineers in China is what one would cost in the US, or 5 engineers in China is what one would cost in the US. And so it's all about money, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, which is amazing to me. But I think the thing is that we could be in a situation where some companies are going to end up potentially maybe losing their intellectual property, losing their livelihood, if you will. And that's what scared the bejesus out of people in boardrooms across the world, actually. And that's why the term de-risking really came to be. And so we've been designing exercises that basically create this kind of situation where something occurs in one of their big offices or a big data center, and it gets taken over by the Chinese, and that basically they just take everything. And I will tell you that most of the people working there are Chinese nationals. And if somebody comes in from the government and says, I need your password, what do you think they're going to say, Alex?
Well, it's China. Okay, here you go.
Yeah, right. That's exactly what they're going to do. It's exactly what they're going to do. So that's not that they're being disloyal to the company, but they're Chinese and they're going to, be respectful to their nation, and for lots of reasons. So the other thing that's going on right now in China that's important to keep in mind, which ties to all of this, is really 2 things. One is that Xi, the president, or prime minister, I guess he's a prime minister, he in 2015 came out with something made in China 2025. And that was a kind of an edict that he issued to the country saying that there were 9 industries that he wanted to make sure that China was approaching best of class in 10 years, 2025, which by the way is about 18 months from now, if you're paying any attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's several things that they haven't made much progress on, but one of them is semiconductors. So if you follow kind of technology at all in the world, you'll know that the biggest manufacturer of semiconductors and probably the most sophisticated is TSMC. And where are they located?
Taiwan.
Taiwan. That's right. 60% of all the very, very, very sophisticated chips come from TSMC. And in some cases, depending on what chip you're talking about, they produce as much as 90%. So they are semiconductors. And so that's also just really increased the anxiety level, not only on the part of the people in Taiwan, but it should raise the anxiety level of anybody worldwide who puts a computer chip in anything. Because 9 times out of 10, it's probably was designed and maybe manufactured by TSMC. And so that means that anything that's part of that supply chain of TSMC, whether it's the type of machinery they're using, the software design, any of that stuff is at risk. And that's a huge issue. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, we still buy a ton of stuff from China. And so companies have huge exposures, and we all saw that in the pandemic. So this little thing I'm talking about with China is not just for those people who have offices over there. Frankly, it's for the world. If China really decides to do something dramatic, it would be catastrophic to the world's economic system and God knows what else.
Well, the pandemic proved that it can already be catastrophic.
Right.
Absolutely. Still today, I was talking with someone on Friday at a client site where they were talking about ordering some equipment, and they said it still takes a long time, months, to get something.
Right. Well, we're also seeing that not just in equipment, but we're seeing it, at least in the United States and in Canada, pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. There are 2 countries that produce most of the pharmaceuticals in the world, China and India. And there still is a wide variety of pharmaceuticals, many of them life-saving. Cancer therapies is one of them that comes right to my mind, where they're back ordered forever. So we are so connected with many of these places around the world that I don't know how we can de-risk it. But what I would say to anybody who's listening in the continuity space is that you should be really thinking about what your connections are to China. I'm not saying that you should try and stop them. I'm saying you should understand the risk. And what I have found interesting in the work that I've been doing over the last 6 months in relationship to this topic is that it's so difficult still for many companies to tease apart where things are in design processes, where things come from. It's still difficult. And so what I would say to anybody is that supply chain, I know you thought was the pandemic 2020 through 2023 problem. Well, no, I think it's going to be the ongoing problem. And part of it is because we are so connected to these places now that are really volatile. And really, we have these tensions with that if we don't understand what's going on deeply and every one of the ways that we could be affected, that we're all going to be at risk. And that's what's driving boards right now, big corporations, to make their executives do exercises and deeply understand what the risk is, because most people still don't know 100%. And I know that may sound crazy, but I'll tell you, I've talked to a zillion companies and they don't know exactly.
Yeah.
And that's a huge risk. And that's like the polycrisis of our lifetime right now.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons why African leaders went to Ukraine, because if the war continues, the famine that multiple places in Africa are experiencing is going to continue.
Right. Oh,
And
yes.
they are already knowing that the longer this goes on, we're going to have, sadly, more deaths.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and if the war continues, you know, things change, you know, with what's been happening recently, then Africa is going to suffer,
Right. Absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
know, more
And
than
I
it
think,
already is.
right, right. And I think, and this goes, and this, and it's compounded also then when you lay another crisis on top of it, which is climate change, and thinking about Africa in particular and thinking about crops. You know, there's many places right now where there are droughts in Africa where they've had a really difficult time growing what they normally grow because of either drought or just severe heat. I mean, look at India. It's been just boiling. Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
That those places can't grow the crops that they normally have, or they're just frying in the fields. And it used to be in the old days that, for example, Ukraine, because they're like the second or third wheat producer in the world, they could have this huge crop of wheat and be able to send that to all of these different countries as a big cushion to protect them when their crops failed. And now that's not available for the most part. And so there was just all of these things. So you see one crisis in one part of the world, and you may think, oh, it doesn't impact me. Well, you know, that's not true. If you start teasing it all apart, it really does. And then the instability that causes in another part of the world, well, then cascades to another part of the world. And then we have this really catastrophic series of things that we have now. So I think this goes back to what we talked about last time we met last month, which is that we need to expand our vision and always be deeply curious and always asking why when we look at all of these things, because they're all connected. But if we look at our crises that are in front of us with just a tight focus, we are missing how it's going to impact us going forward in all of these different ways. And China, Ukraine, Africa, all of that is such a great example. And looking at the destabilization, when you look at climate in particular, it's making people move all over the world, because if you can't feed your families, you're moving.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening in Africa. So then they start moving, and that destabilizes another country, and then they get on boats and they try and get into Europe, and then there's all of that goes on. It's a huge destabilizing factor. So we need to always have a very big vision in our work, because the world is so interconnected in this polycrisis environment that we live in right now.
Yeah. And you know, people really do have to understand they got to look beyond their direct supplier. You know, I'm not worried. I buy my product from somebody down the street. Yeah, but they're getting it from Ukraine or China or whatever. Right. You know, you got to look beyond that initial supplier. You've got to look at the second, third, and maybe beyond. To your point, all the connectedness that's out there.
Right. So I think the most important thing is that in the polycrisis world, all of the individuals in our field of work have to be deeply curious and always asking why, and dig into all of these things, because otherwise we'll be flat-footed and we will not succeed.
And on that note, we've come to the end of the show, Regina. Certainly is a summer of crises. It'll be interesting to see where we are next month.
Oh yes, in the heat of July. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Thank you so much, Regina. Always a pleasure to chat with you.
Thank you, Alex. It's always great to be with you.
And everyone watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.